Welcome to this short presentation on different types of neurotransmitters, chemical messengers, which are found in the brain. In the psychology textbook, you will find a helpful table, table 2.1, on page 53 of the third edition that has many of the neurotransmitters I'm going to talk about today listed there and their main functions. The very first neurotransmitter we're going to discuss is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine was actually the first neurotransmitter to be discovered by Otto Loewi back in the 1920s. Acetylcholine is released by nerves in the neuromuscular junctions and binds to receptors on your muscles, causing them to contract. Receptors of acetylcholine can be blocked by curare, and this will cause paralysis. Curare is a chemical that is found in plants in the Amazon and has been used by tribe members there while they're hunting. They will put curare on the tip of their blow darts to paralyze the animals that they're hunting. Because curare is something that blocks the acetylcholine receptor, we call it an antagonist. I have a picture of a black widow spider on this slide as well, because the venom in black widow spiders can also bind to acetylcholine receptors. But instead of blocking them, it'll activate them, causing your muscles to contract very rapidly and causing people to have painful and possibly deadly convulsions. In the brain, though, acetylcholine has many different functions. It's involved in memory formation and attention. And actually, caffeine indirectly increases the amount of acetylcholine available in your brain, and that's one reason why people may feel more alert and have more energy after they've had coffee in the morning. The next neurotransmitter I want to tell you about is glutamate. Glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, found in many regions of the brain. It is involved in learning, memory formation, as well as nervous system development. Glutamate is essential for you to form memories. If someone is on a medication that blocks glutamate receptors, it may prevent them actually for forming memories while they were under the influence of that medication or drug. The third neurotransmitter we're going to talk about today is called GABA for short. Its full name is gamma-aminobutyric acid, but everyone just calls this chemical messenger GABA, even the neuroscientists. So you do not need to know its long name. While glutamate was the major excitatory neurotransmitter, GABA is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So if glutamate is like the accelerator, GABA would be the brakes. It can turn off or inhibit different brain regions. It causes calmness, sleepiness, reduced inhibitions, as well as decreased pain sensations. Now, my question to you would be, does this sound like the effects of consuming alcohol or another drug, perhaps? If you thought that, you are correct, because both alcohol and anti-anxiety medications like Valium or Xanax are GABA agonists, meaning they can cross the blood-brain barrier, they can go into your brain and bind to those GABA receptors and activate them much in the same way that the GABA neurotransmitter would. And, you know, someone who has a couple drinks of alcohol will have reduced inhibitions, feel more relaxed, more happy. But if you drink too much alcohol or overdose on anti-anxiety meds, it can be really dangerous, especially if people are taking those drugs in combination. It's dangerous to drink alcohol while on anti-anxiety meds because they both work on the same neurotransmitter system in the brain, GABA. And if GABA levels are increased enough, then vital areas of the brain will be turned off. Not just your inhibitions, but also parts of the brain which control your breathing and your heart rate. And usually that's what happens if someone who has overdosed on alcohol or Xanax, is their respiration rate gets so depressed that they just quit breathing in their sleep. Now, serotonin is a neurotransmitter you might have heard of before. It's recently got a lot of attention in the news and the media. It has many different effects or functions in the brain. It's associated with sleep, mood, and appetite. Low levels of serotonin, neuroscientists believe, may be linked to depression. Part of the reason they've come up with this hypothesis, and that's what it is, it's just a theory right now, but is because of the way popular antidepressant drugs work in the brain. One class of antidepressant drugs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs for short. Prozac and Zoloft, Paxil are all drugs of this class. And they are the most commonly prescribed type of medication to patients with depression, and they seem to be pretty effective at alleviating the symptoms of depression in people who take them. What these drugs do in the brain is they block the reuptake transporter proteins for serotonin, and then serotonin molecules remain in the synapse longer, and they can continue to bind with those serotonin receptors, activating the next cell. The last neurotransmitter we're going to learn about today is dopamine. Dopamine has many different functions in different regions of the brain. It is important for learning and reward, and it has earned the nickname of the pleasure chemical. Whenever you do something rewarding like eating, spending time with friends, having sex, dopamine is released in the reward center of the brain. Many drugs of abuse which have the potential to be addicting, also cause a surge of dopamine to be released in the brain, leading a user to experience a high or euphoria. So that's why dopamine is often thought of as the pleasure chemical. But that's not the only thing it does in the brain. In the movement control center of the brain, it plays an important role in regulating our motor signals. And so for people who have movement disorders like Parkinson's disease, they have the symptoms of Parkinson's, which is a hard time initiating and controlling movements because dopamine neurons have died off in that brain region. And one way to try to treat Parkinson's disease is to give those patients L-DOPA or levodopa, and this is a drug that's a precursor for dopamine. It's able to cross the blood-brain barrier, go into your brain, and then hopefully be converted into dopamine in your brain. Dopamine has also been implicated in different psychological disorders. Normal levels of dopamine have been linked to schizophrenia, for example. There's a dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, which says that high levels of dopamine in one area of the brain and low levels of dopamine in another area of the brain may be responsible for some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, like the hallucinations and the delusions. So I briefly mentioned on the last slide that drugs of abuse will cause a surge of dopamine to be released in the reward center of the brain, and this is what leads many of them to be addicting. And I thought it would be worth noting at this point briefly how drugs can mimic neurotransmitters and can cross the blood-brain barrier. These are drugs found in beverages, in food, in plants. And in the brain, these chemicals are structurally similar enough to the neurotransmitters themselves that they can bind to the neurotransmitter receptors and activate them or block them, depending on if it's an agonist or an antagonist. And many of these drugs of abuse are actually hijacking the brain's reward system. And that's why they can be so addicting, and people can develop both psychological and physical dependency on drugs of abuse. This diagram here is illustrating how a cocaine molecule would affect neurons in the brain. And so what cocaine does is it can block the dopamine reuptake transporter, and therefore it increases the amount of dopamine available in the synapse. And so those orange molecules would be the dopamine molecules, and they could continue binding with those receptors on the neighboring neuron, activating it and giving the user a high feeling, but can be dangerous because of the potential for abuse and addiction there. I hope you enjoyed learning about different chemical messengers, also known as neurotransmitters in the brain. And now when you hear someone talking about dopamine or serotonin, you'll be able to associate the neurotransmitter with some of its functions.